let's talk about the basics. Let's talk about how role-based access control works in Denodo. First of all, this slide here shows it's sort of an overview of everything that has to do with security in Denodo. So, security in Denodo can mean anything from integration with Key Vaults to putting into place TLS to integrating with Kerberos or something like that. That's not what we're going to be talking about today. What we're going to be talking about today is specifically role-based access control. So that's sort of the building block of security in Denodo. We're going to talk about tag-based security, which goes on from there, goes into ABAC capabilities as well. And we're going to talk about how you can use all of that to put into place fine-grained access control. So you're probably familiar with what I'm presenting on this slide, but just to go through it step by step. Authorization in Denodo is role-based. So basically, once somebody is authenticated to the platform, Denodo will know which roles they have. Usually these roles are provided via Active Directory LDAP or maybe identity provider groups. And so the groups will map to roles which are known by Denodo. And then those roles will grant permissions via various scope. So the first scope is going to be the virtual database level. So for a virtual database, you can give a user the right to connect, the right to create certain objects, and so on. So that's the biggest scope, if you will. After that, you can go down to a lower level and grant access, either metadata access to see the structure or execute access to read the data, or even potentially update access to change the data at the view level. Then within a view, you can control whether or not different rows are visible, and whether different columns are visible as well. And finally, you can mask individual cell values, and that goes back to the masking or redaction functionality that I mentioned before. So I encourage people when they start thinking about security to really think carefully about how they organize their virtual databases, because as I mentioned, that's sort of the first building block of this whole design. Okay, so as I explained, Denodo security is based on roles, but what does that mean? It's important to kind of step back and think about the implications. So first of all, default access is no access, and it's as you combine your roles that you're going to combine the access that you have. So if you have, for example, two roles, role A and role B, they may or may not have some permissions which are shared between them. Here in this, I imagine that they are. But if I have both of those roles, then I'm going to have all of the permissions that are granted by either role A or role B. Okay, so that's pretty obvious, but it's important to understand a few subtleties, let's say. First of all, if you give execute access to somebody over a view, and they have enough privileges to create a view and assign privileges to that view that they've created, well, you're also in fact indirectly giving them the ability to control access to your original view. So that's why it's important also to think about who has create privileges, even if it may be in a separate virtual database. Also important, and this in the next slide I'm going to explain it a little bit in detail, it depends where you place restrictions within a view hierarchy really controls how those roles will combine and what that will mean. So here, let's take a look at that in detail. Okay, so this slide is actually built from a screenshot of one of the knowledge base articles that we linked to in the end, and I encourage you to take it, a look at it and read it to really understand I'm just going into some of the information that's in that article. But when you are combining roles and those roles have a fine-grained restriction, you have to understand how they're going to work together. So in the example from that document, there are two different roles. One of them is customer service DE, which basically grants access to only customers which are in Germany. So that's why you have this Germany DE filtering. And then you have customer service VIP, which grants access only to VIP customers. But what's important to note here is that they're built from a single view hierarchy, but the filtering is applied at different levels. So you have the top customer view, which is a selection of the unified customer view, which is a selection of the customer view. And you'll see that here the filtering is at unified customer, and here it's at the customer level. So why does that matter? Well, in order to understand, you have to look at these sort of red eyes here, and those represent what we call indirect visibility. So it's a level of the view hierarchy where you have implicit visibility or indirect visibility, I'll use the same term, because at a higher level you've got execute privileges. So because at the higher level of top customers you have execute privileges, that is considered indirect visibility at a lower level. And when you go across the view hierarchy and you add those up, that means that you have indirect visibility or direct visibility at every single level. So what that means concretely is that if you combine the roles, then you no longer have any restrictions at all. You see the entire customer base, which is usually not what you want to do, which is why you have to consider and really harmonize the level at which you put your fine-grained restrictions. This also is important to know that this changed recently. This changed in the January update of version 8. Previously, you didn't have this notion of indirect visibility, and you could combine the roles and have a more restrictive combination. So in this case, in those previous updates, combining the two roles would mean you could only see VIP customers from Germany. This was considered not really compatible with the notion of RBAC, which is why it was changed. But it's important to be aware and to accompany customers who may have implemented this in this fashion. Okay, it's also important to know how cache and fine-grained restrictions work together. So first, the good news is that when you cache a view which has fine-grained restrictions, Denodo will apply the restrictions in exactly the same way, which is what you expect, but it's good to know. However, cache and fine-grained restrictions at a lower level, this is another case in which you need to take into account the level in the view hierarchy at which the restrictions are placed, are incompatible. And so to illustrate, I'll explain. If you have a role, sales analysts in EMEA, and they have access, let's say, to a view called sales by region, which is actually a selection of sales by store. If you cache that view, well, you're fine if you placed your fine-grained restriction at that level. If you placed it at the sales by store level, however, you're not okay. That restriction will disappear. Why does it disappear? Well, when you're selecting from a view, the columns which you need to implement a restriction may no longer be there. You may have not selected them or aggregated them away, or they may not be available in the cached copy. And whether they're available or not doesn't matter because the restriction is systematically removed. So again, an important thing to keep in mind. Also be aware, and this I think is more obvious, but it's important to underline nonetheless, if you're using pass-through credentials to a data source, you should not cache views from that data source because, of course, the cache database is not going to be able to authenticate the user in the same way. So your cached copy will not be consistent with those restrictions.